Amidst the fire and fury of the president's executive order suspending all immigration, we at FAIR are going to tell you what exactly the president did last week, what's in the executive order, what's not, and what's to come. Hi, I'm Dan Stein, president of FAIR. Thanks for joining us, and I'm joined by RJ Hauman, FAIR's Government Relations Director, and Matt O'Brien, FAIR's Director of Research. All right, guys, give me a quick rundown. The president had big promises, okay? He said, bringing you a Lamborghini, but we got a go-kart, okay? RJ, what's the takeaway?
Well, obviously, as you said, yeah, we were delivered a go-kart instead of that Lamborghini last week when he signed his EO on Wednesday. You know, we were thrilled. I think thrilled of everybody who's watching this was also thrilled is when President Trump obviously tweeted on last Monday, a week from today, that he would be suspending immigration into the country to really protect American workers as coronavirus is obviously ravaging the economy. This is something.
26 million unemployed now, right?
Oh, 26 million now. And this is also something, too, that's popular.
The Great Depression.
Around 80%, wanted a complete pause on immigration coming to the country. It's also on strong legal footing. Keep in mind that the Supreme Court confirmed the president's ability to do so. But again, it sounds great. But then when we actually looked at it, it's clear that, some swamp creatures in the president's orbit and business lobbyists got to him. The executive order does not deliver all the way. And I think Matt's going to get into this a little bit on just how many immigrants this actually affects due to FAIR's analysis. But again, this thing is loaded with carve-outs and exemptions. It keeps in the biggest category of family-based immigration in place. Goes after some employment-based categories, but also even contained a carve-out for EB-5, which is Chinese investor visas.
Yeah, we ought to talk about that.
Crisis that originates from China. So we're going to allow their investors to come here? That's wild. And then the biggest thing, obviously, that we're raising a fuss about and really going after the administration, both in public and behind the scenes on, is it contains zero exemption. It contains a mass exemption, if you will, when it comes to guest workers. It keeps cheap labor flowing into the country as we're getting to Great Depression levels of unemployment. Again, we were at 3%. We're probably over 20 now. We'll see that in the coming weeks. And again, President Trump, fortunately, there is a little area in the executive order that says in 30 days, the secretaries of Homeland Security, Labor, and State have to give him a recommendation of what he can do to protect American workers by limiting guest workers coming into the country. So we're telling him he's got 30 days to make things right, limit guest workers coming in, truly help American workers, not an exemption-filled little thing that you can sell to the press.
So the FAIR analysis got a lot of attention nationally in the national media right out of the box, and Matt O'Brien went to work taking a look at what's in there. Matt, you want to elaborate on any of the sort of fine points of the order?
Sure. So what we did is we took a look at this from the standpoint of what would it do if it just affected one of the smaller categories of immigrant visas, which is people who are getting an immigrant visa or people who are being admitted to the U.S. for lawful permanent residence. And at the low end, if it affected one of the smaller categories, you'd have about 5,000 people affected. If you took the entire number of immigrant visas that the Department of State issues in a month and took a look at this as a 60-day pause, then it would affect probably about 80,000 people. But the fact is that we give about 1.2 million people a year lawful permanent residence status. So if the president had really wanted to protect the American workers, what he would have done was taken a look at the specific categories and said, well, here's the categories where people are really competing with Americans for jobs. We're going to stop those for a defined period of time. And then I think you would have taken a look at the family-based immigration and said, listen, most of these people are coming from abroad, many of them in places where there's a risk of having COVID-19, and they're all likely to wind up becoming public charges if we admit them. So there was an opportunity here both to avoid competition with U.S. workers, but also an opportunity to reinforce the fact that the public charge issue is a big deal. And when we can't afford to give benefits to Americans who are out of work due to government-enforced shutdowns, we shouldn't be bringing in foreigners that need federal money.
Well, the argument is being made now that actually more employment-based visas will be made available, right? I mean, first of all, a lot of the employment-based visas already go to people already inside the U.S. There are people.
Yeah, 140,000 employment-based visas are available. 80% of them go to people who are currently like guest workers here. A lot of the H-1B people that came and replaced American jobs. Only about 20% of them come from abroad. Yeah, so if you take out some family-based categories, everything, those are going to go there.
Well, Dan, that brings up the other point. if you're going to do this, you can't just do the lawful permanent residents. We have about 330 million discrete admissions of people coming here temporarily every year. And many of those are on programs like the H-1B, the H-2A, the H-2B, the L-1 intercompany transferee. And those people are all taking up positions, even the international corporate transfers are taking up positions that before we had these programs were filled by Americans. So with close to 27 million Americans out of work, why are we admitting those people temporarily at all, especially when we're telling Americans they can't leave their houses because of the current crisis?
Well, look at the EB-5 program. For some reason, that was exempted. So it seems like the president was influenced by people who didn't want it to have any economic impact and certainly weren't particularly interested in protecting American workers. The people who are most directly affected by the actual executive order are family relations, right? People with relatives.
Well, look at the EB-5 thing. I mean, that was crazy. There was a group of Republicans who wanted to increase the number of EB-5 visas available from 10,000 to 175,000, and something like 80 or 90% of those visas go to the Chinese. Why, in the midst of this situation, do we want to be admitting more Chinese to compete with Americans who are out of jobs because something that the Chinese did?
Well,
yeah, and this was something, too, that they tried to insert in the CARES Act, which was obviously the biggest coronavirus stimulus bill that gave the recovery rebate checks to the American people.
This is in early March.
The payroll protection program and other things like that. You know, Lindsey Graham was pushing to expand the EB-5 program as part of that.
They weren't denied after FAIR uncovered it.
We did uncover that, and we were lobbying against it heavily. I sure was when I was still back in Washington. But again, this was included. This was something that even shocked a lot of reporters and people that are on the other side of the issue compared to us, that carve-out was included. Again, as Matt mentioned too, it's bad politically and it's terrible policy to include that in there. And this is one program.
Look, the EB-5 program has been proven to be a fraud-ridden scam over and
absolutely.
over. And
it's something
developers use to attract capital in exchange for selling the right to live in America.
Mostly absolutely. There's this case too of gerrymandering as well. It was originally intended to help develop rural and impoverished areas in our country, but they gerrymander these districts. So they'll go to some rural place in Texas or Nebraska and connect it all the way up to New York so they can develop something like Hudson Yards in Manhattan. You know, EB-5 too is one interesting issue where there's bipartisan consensus that the program is flawed. Senator Grassley, a Republican from Iowa, and then Leahy from Vermont hate the program, and they work well on it together. But one other thing on how I think this was included here is, listen, President Trump, as he's trying to do his task force and everything to address the crisis from the public health angle and then from the economic angle, I don't think he has ever had more business leaders, lobbyists, CEOs in his ear than he does right now. We've always had to fight against corporate interests and businesses that are relying on cheap foreign labor when it comes to making sure Americans aren't competing with them. But now these people, the moment he echoes anything on the protecting American workers front or limiting immigration, I bet the guy gets 30 calls in the Oval Office from business leaders saying, whoa, Mr. President, you can't do that.
Well, people who voted for Trump, what are they expecting him to do? What do they expect? I don't know.
Well, I think President
Trump, is that he made certain promises to the American people about what his priorities were going to be, and somehow there are folks in the White House who believe that those promises don't matter. If somebody's axe gets gored or somebody's bull gets gored, and this is, I understand that it's important for the president to retain some support.
And there's people in the administration, at the agency level that I think Matt can echo very well, and at the White House as well, that are repulsed by the very restrictionist policies that got him elected in the first place.
Well, then why are they working for him? They shouldn't be working for him.
That's a great point. There's swamp creatures all over the administration. We could point them to a lot of people that would help implement the things that got him elected. And again, this is such a political minefield that they're in right now. And again, we're advocating for a lot of these things because they're good policy, not to help him get reelected. But again, he was propelled to the White House on a lot of policies. You know what? He's kind of ignoring them to some extent right now. And we're telling him it's not a smart thing to do.
Well, and in a certain measure, it's a deep state issue. If you look at what happened with Trump v. Hawaii, it's pretty obvious to anyone with any legal training who read 1182F that the president clearly had the authority to do what was inappropriately called the Muslim travel ban. Letitia James, the AG of New York, Zoe Lofgren and Gerald Nadler have already threatened to sue over the temporary pause in the face of a Supreme Court case, a Supreme Court holding that couldn't be any more explicit about the authorities that the president has. So this is a president who ran as the guy who was going to get tough on immigration. So the American people are expecting him to do that. And he's doing himself a disservice when he listens to all these entrenched interests who are more concerned about relying on foreign markets and foreign labor to make profits than they are about the 26 million Americans who are currently out of work due to a government-enforced shutdown that many of the scientists are even questioning whether it was necessary in the first place. I mean, it's just politically tone-deaf if you're Donald Trump.
Hey, Matt, to add one thing about those people that you mentioned, Lofgren and Nadler, I mean, they don't care about the rule of law. He's on firm legal footing. They don't care about secure borders. They don't care about his authority. I mean, you got to keep in mind, these are the same people. The House was about to vote on a bill called the No Ban Act to get rid of the president's authority to suspend travel coming from China and things like that. And they're now acting like they supported it. He wasn't going far enough on that. Again, these are people you can't deal with. But again, at the same time, he has people that he can't deal with and that don't agree with him right 20 yards down the hallway. And that is a big problem right now.
Why don't you send him a short list, RJ, and tell him who he can, okay?
I will do.
We don't lose faith in the president, though, because he's got another bite at the apple. And as you mentioned earlier, RJ, there's a provision in this executive order that says they're going to look at these non-immigrant guest worker programs over the next 30 days. Right. And so he has a chance to redeem himself, right? And folks out there need to be part of that process, all of our members and the activists around the country. What should the president be shutting down 26 days from now?
Well, Dan, what you mentioned though too is as I think a lot of our not listeners but people who are watching right now notice that our letter that you sent to President Trump, urging him, hey,
downloaded by thousands of people now.
Yeah, thousands of people, and in many Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Hill, all these Fox News, everybody covered it as well. Where again, Fair was asking him again, you have 30 days to make things right. Do a blanket pause on all immigration, whether it's non-immigrant visas, like all the guest worker programs, and then expand what you've been doing in the family categories. But I think, again, a lot of the things we've been pointing to and what the president should do, and even calling him out a little bit for not including the guest worker programs, which would help Americans the most immediately. Again, you have seen Chad Wolf, the DHS secretary, was on Fox News over the weekend, and he said, we are looking strongly at these guest worker programs and will likely make recommendations to the president. So again, they're hearing Fair loud and clear, and a lot of other people that are aligned with us, they're hearing us. And I think something positive can happen. Again, we just want expand it to everything. Don't do any carve-outs. Protect the American worker.
I'm going to be tweeting the White House and calling the White House and just say, shut it down, right? Shut it down.
Make your voice heard. Make your voice heard. From your couch.
Matt, for clarity's sake, I mean, you were suggesting that the shutdown was maybe unnecessary and that all this unemployment that we're experiencing didn't have to happen. Is that what you were saying?
Well, there's a lot of debate, Dan. I mean, I'm not a scientist. My background is in law and political science. But one thing I do know is, we live in a constitutional federalist democracy, and there's supposed to be input from all different kinds of authorities here. And what seems to have gone on is a lot of deep state Democrats that don't like the fact that Trump won the election seem to be doing crazy things to grab power. I mean, Gavin Newsom filled in skateboard parks with 37 tons of sand to keep people from using them. I don't understand how a bunch of kids getting some fresh air in a skateboard park is a big public health crisis. But I know for certain, because I've written on this many times and researched it deeply, people coming from outside of the United States into the U.S. presents a public health crisis. That's exactly how we wound up in this particular circumstance. Doesn't really matter whether it was an immigrant or a U.S. citizen that brought this here. It's a virus that originated outside of the U.S. and migration, movement of people from one place to another, brought it in here. And while you have a lot of people saying silly things like, well, viruses don't respect borders. Well, viruses don't move on their own power. They don't walk across borders or hijack planes and fly across them. They hitch a ride on people. And so I think when you are in the middle of a crisis where we have put 26.5 million Americans, more or less, out of work, and have many of them wondering if they're ever going to financially recover from this. And you're telling them that they can't go to their jobs and earn a living because they have to stay home to halt the spread of the virus. Where do the politicians get off saying that they're going to admit all of these foreigners that they haven't tested for COVID-19 and who are then going to compete with American jobs? Why are they letting those people into the country at all? It's absurd.
Speaking of what Matt said on the testing front as well, one thing the administration did do, and we called them out on it as well, for the H2 guest worker programs, you have H2A, which are seasonal ag workers, which 90% of them come from Mexico, a country that is not doing anything on the coronavirus front. Whether that's a good thing or not, I agree with Matt to some extent as well, but they're not doing anything at the community level. People can just roam free throughout the country. What we did, and for H2B visas as well, which are a lot of seasonal leisure recreational employees, lifeguards at your pool, people who work at a theme park, many coming from
many of whom come from the Middle East, Eastern Europe and Asia, where this thing is raging right now.
But what they did too is to accelerate the ability of a lot of these people to come into the country, they gutted the interview portion. So the one time, a consular official would see the person, they got rid of that. If they were still going to come in, which we're saying they're not, they should be tested. But we're even getting rid of the opportunity for a United States official to even see them. That is we're going in the opposite direction.
And they waived the health requirements.
The health requirement too, yeah.
We have raised that issue. FAIR, when you support FAIR, you're supporting your voice here in Washington. And we raise these issues with the administration that they are doing these things, as we've noted in this letter. And that's what was so unfortunate about this executive order. And also this further evidence that the agricultural community seems to have politicians under some kind of gun, because I guess they tell the inner city politicians, if you don't do what we want, the price of produce will go up, and the rural politician, if you don't do this what we want, the crops will rot in fields, and they always invariably get their way. Now, Senator Tom Cotton over the weekend on Fox Business made some allegations about China, something to the effect that he felt China had intentionally sought to move this virus around the world by not banning travel from Wuhan to international airports after they had already banned travel from Wuhan to the rest of China. Is there any consensus on Capitol Hill that is a truthful assessment, or do our intelligence communities agree with that? Because that would certainly implicate the importance of having Section 212F and retaining the president's ability to suspend admission when you're dealing with a hostile foreign power using, that's really a form of biowarfare.
And Tom Cotton has been
Cotton all by himself on this thing.
Yeah, Tom Cotton was pointing this out. The guy was ridiculed, like in late February and early March, for pointing out what all.
Who else agrees with him on this? Because I'm wondering, is there any consensus that that's actually true, that the Chinese intentionally spread the thing?
Go back.
Oh, well, I don't know if there's any formal consensus, but a lot of the scientific literature, which we in the research department have been following, seems to indicate that this was not something that came from a wet market, that it either was the Chinese were deliberately trying to set up a program to deal with deadly viruses. They claim it was a CDC type of operation. And there appears to have been some kind of a breakdown in the protocols for handling the kind of level 4 containment that needs to go on with those things. What's not clear is whether this was a virus that was derived from a sample and from research trying to figure out cures for viruses, as the Chinese claim, or whether there was an unlawful attempt against international law to try and create a bioweapon, and somehow this accidentally got released and went beyond the control of the Chinese. What we don't know right now is what the real numbers of infected and the real numbers of dead in China are. China doesn't seem willing to share that information. And China has a very robust information operation that engages in both deception, fake news, and active attempts to try and nullify U.S. news narratives. And they were spreading rumors in countries in the developing world and throughout Asia that this was a U.S. Army-created virus that had been released intentionally by the U.S.
Right.
So there's something funny going on.
Well, I was specifically asking about this question, that when the Chinese government shut down Wuhan for travel domestically throughout the rest of China, did they keep open Wuhan travel to the rest of the world for a period of time? In other words, before President Trump shut down Chinese travel to the United States, that period, where Nancy Pelosi was waltzing around Chinatown in San Francisco telling everybody there was nothing to worry about. I mean, was there an intentional effort? This is Cotton is saying that the Chinese government did not want to suffer the economic consequences of a pandemic by itself, but instead wanted to share the goods with the rest of the world, so everybody else was dragged down with China at the same time. Is there any shred of consensus that that's a legitimate assessment?
I don't know if there's any shred of consensus at this point, but if I were a betting man, I would say that Senator Cotton is correct. There were somewhere, depending
that
upon...
would be something on the order of, something in the annals of world criminal history that goes, it would be up there with anything that the Nazis in Germany did, or certainly anything involving the Roman Empire, or anything in Syria. I mean, it's a form of germ warfare, isn't it?
Well, if you look at the number of people that were allowed to leave China and enter the United States before President Trump shut down travel,
that's what I'm asking about.
Well, it looks like there was somewhere between 45 and 80,000 people who are allowed to travel from China to the United States. Nobody has come out and said how
many of whom were U.S. citizens coming.
Many of whom were U.S. citizens, but nonetheless, it's like I said, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter who was coming back. If the virus hitched a ride with you, then it's something that's being brought by international travel.
Yeah. One other note on this front too is, Cotton is obviously privy to information we are not, given his power in the Senate, and he's an ex-military guy. We trust him on this. But again, the fact that, Democrats, especially in the House, like Nancy Pelosi, are going to be I think they're already putting it together, some panel to investigate things and everything. They're not going to try to investigate what we actually need to know.
Right.
Most of this, what China was doing, all they care about is damaging President Trump politically. You got Adam Schiff is probably going to lead the way, whether they're these corrupt open borders politicians that just hate the guy for doing any restrictionist immigration policies. And that's a shame. That's what Washington's become these days.
I mean, what would you say the Democratic Party has articulated as an immigration control response to the coronavirus epidemic at this point? What would they have done? What would they do?
Well, it's interesting too, though. It's like now they're basically now saying that they agreed with what President Trump did, and he didn't go far enough. Nancy Pelosi's out there on TV shows blasting for having 40,000 people that still came back, even though there were a lot of U.S. citizens. Remember, again, I mentioned this earlier. At the time, the No Ban Act was about to go on the floor, getting rid of his authority here. They did the right thing and pulled it.
Would the Democrats have banned travel from China?
No, they would not. But now
I don't know
they're
that
acting like they would.
They never would have?
I don't think they ever
at the
would
time.
have.
At the time, Joe Biden was out there on his low-energy campaign rallies calling Trump a racist xenophobe for going down this path. But nobody in the media, as he's right now, saying, oh, you didn't go far enough. You weren't successful in it. You didn't do it soon enough. It would be helpful if they point back and say, hey, you said this at the time. Do you regret this? How worse would things be had he not done that?
Dan, these were the same crazy people that were accusing the president of being a racist for calling it the Chinese virus.
Right.
Now, I don't think these people have any problem with anyone calling a Chinese restaurant a Chinese restaurant. So why is it racist to call a virus that we know originated in China and nowhere else the Chinese virus?
Because it came out of his mouth.
I mean, we got, the Spanish flu. Nobody had a fit about that.
West Nile, Lyme disease.
The long and the short answer is you're saying that Joe Biden would have surged masks and ventilators faster, but not done anything about immigration controls.
Well, I don't think he would have done anything about immigration control, but what's more is he couldn't have surged ventilators and masks because we offshored the production of the masks to China. Those are jobs that American...
Signed the No Ban Act. Would he have signed the No Ban Act if Congress had passed it and sent it to him in the middle of a massive pandemic?
I'm sure he would have.
Yeah.
Because for
I think he would have, absolutely.
Awfully interesting question that ought to be asked.
It is. Yeah. Well, if hopefully if the campaign can get started again. Dan, there's one other thing as we kind of wrap up that I do want to inform people about too. What's happening here in Washington? So everybody knows that there's going to be another round of coronavirus stimulus coming through. This time, and this is what Democrats want more than anything. It was something that was almost the red line about the bill that passed recently, which would replenish the PPP, the Small Business Lending Program, is they want about $250 billion or so in state and local funding. Here's the problem with that. States and localities, you have states like California, localities like New York City, Chicago, they are giving money to people that are here illegally for coronavirus purposes, not health related, but economic assistance. That's going to be a problem. If the federal government gives states like California, and again, localities like Chicago and New York City, money with no strings attached, that money, federal taxpayer dollars, is going to go to illegal aliens. That's a big problem. We're going to fight against that and make sure Mitch McConnell and even House leadership that's involved, and obviously President Trump, have a hard line on that. Number two, a DACA ruling on the president's ending of DACA could drop in the coming weeks. And you know dang well that when that happens, Democrats are going to take a stand and try to attach an amnesty to an essential coronavirus-related bill. We got to take a firm stand on that as well. The American people need help, not illegal aliens.
You know, the whole question of sanctuary city jurisdictions and their bond ratings at this point ought to be an interesting one. Why would a sanctuary city or jurisdiction be able to enjoy AAA bond rating when they're running themselves?
Yeah, Dan, they don't just need funding. They're not just looking for supplementary funding. They're going to need to be bailed out. I don't even think California has the ability to give unemployment checks in the month of May.
Well, New York City breaking down.
California was a public health crisis before this. I mean, if you've been following the news, they've been having trouble removing the feces from the streets in LA and San Francisco for two reasons, because they've allowed the homeless to camp everywhere. And as sanctuary cities, they've attracted massive numbers of illegal aliens who, quite frankly, started their relationship with the United States by breaking the law and don't have any incentive to obey any of the other laws that they encounter here in the U.S. So if you look at this, it's definitely a money and political power issue, but it also just shows the complete hypocrisy of the Democrats. If we keep going the way they're going with this open borders, fill San Francisco and LA up with illegal aliens living on the street, then this COVID outbreak thing is just going to be a drop in the bucket compared to the cholera and diphtheria and all the other measles and other epidemics that are going to get started. So this is a perfect opportunity for the president to hit the reset button and go, listen, this is living proof of why I told you we needed to do this when I started my campaign. And then he should be consistent with what he announced when he came down the golden escalator from the Trump Tower.
Well, to his credit, he's continuing to build the wall. He's continuing to deploy funding and construction crews even during this whole epidemic. So he's serious about building the wall. And Trump has done an awful lot while he's president.
Yeah, the Remain in Mexico program as well has been a paper wall, if you will.
The fact of the matter is that we have been occasionally critical when we have to be about what the administration is doing, but by and large, we've been supportive. But for the next 27 days, we're going to be pressing very hard to try to expand this executive order to include guest workers and all other immigration categories. We need to really take a breather on this foreign labor coming into the country at an extraordinary time, highest unemployment levels really since the Great Depression. This is a huge national problem. This could linger on for quite some time. And so this is the kind of analysis you get at FAIR. For those of you who are involved, it's fairus.org, fairus.org. Love to have your support. Get involved. Sign up. Doesn't cost a thing. We're here for you every day, 24 hours a day, working on the issue. I'm Dan Stein. This is RJ Hauman and Matt O'Brien, and we will see you soon. Thanks, guys.